When does America intervene? The 5 psychological warning signs of a collapsing regime. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a discussion about geopolitics. This is about what happens to the human mind when power becomes afraid. History shows us something terrifying. When regimes begin to collapse, leaders rarely become rational. They become emotional, suspicious, obsessed with control, and that psychological transformation often becomes more dangerous than the crisis itself. Tonight we explore one critical question. When does the United States decide to intervene? Not publicly, not rhetorically, but strategically. Because despite the language of democracy and alliances, global power does not operate on morality alone. It operates on one thing above all else: risk. And once a regime crosses certain psychological and strategic thresholds, intervention becomes increasingly inevitable. Let us begin with a familiar pattern. A country enters severe economic decline. Inflation spirals out of control. Citizens lose faith. Food prices rise. Fear spreads. But instead of admitting failure, the leadership says, this is all the result of foreign sabotage. That is usually the first psychological signal. The second comes quickly afterward. The regime begins tightening media control. Foreign journalists are blocked. Military commanders are replaced repeatedly. Officials suspected of disloyalty disappear. Judges become politically obedient. Opposition leaders, religious figures, and activists suddenly face investigations. At the same time, the government escalates external tensions, declaring neighboring states or allies to be enemies. And then something strange begins to happen. The leader stops acting like a statesman and starts acting like an online combatant. Late-night emotional posts, public rage, direct social media arguments, increasing paranoia toward critics. This is psychologically significant because when leaders become obsessed with controlling narratives rather than solving problems, the regime quietly shifts from governance to survival mode. And survival psychology changes everything. Policies become erratic. Internal loyalty purges intensify. Fear replaces competence. Reality itself becomes distorted inside the system. Citizens sense instability. Protests grow larger. Information spreads faster than censorship can contain it. At this stage, regimes often make the same fatal mistake. They stop treating protesters as citizens and start treating them as enemies. That is when mass arrests begin. And historically, once a government prioritizes control over legitimacy, its collapse accelerates. Now here is where most people misunderstand the United States. Many believe America intervenes primarily because of human rights abuses. That is not entirely accurate. In reality, American strategic thinking revolves around 5 core danger assessments. The first is regime stability. Washington asks, can this government actually survive? Not whether it is democratic, not whether it sounds moral, but whether the structure itself is becoming psychologically unstable. A dictatorship can appear powerful while internally collapsing. Military purges, elite paranoia, rapid policy reversals, competing loyalty factions. These are not signs of strength. They are signs of fear. The second danger signal is internal fracture. This is when the ruling elite begins turning against itself. Military leaders distrust intelligence agencies. Political factions fight internally. Senior officials quietly prepare escape routes or exile plans. At the same time, public resistance becomes organized. Workers, students, religious movements, online activists. When offline resistance merges with digital coordination, the regime enters a very dangerous stage. Because physical force can suppress crowds for a while, but it cannot fully suppress synchronized national consciousness. The third assessment is threat capability. Can this regime become dangerous beyond its borders? Nuclear development, missile systems, cyber warfare, terror financing, and increasingly, drug trafficking networks. Many people underestimate why narcotics matter in international security calculations. But from Washington's perspective, drug money is not simply criminal activity. It is invisible war financing. Drugs fund weapons. Weapons fund militias. Militias destabilize regions. Once criminal economies merge with state structures, America no longer sees a corrupt government. It sees a potential rogue system. The fourth danger assessment is strategic defection. Will the regime abandon the international order entirely? This includes sanctions violations, covert financial transfers, shadow banking, illegal resource trades, and alignment with hostile powers, especially when governments secretly bypass sanctions through shell companies or cryptocurrency networks. The issue becomes larger than law enforcement. It becomes a challenge to the global financial system itself. And finally, the fifth assessment, spillover risk. Will the crisis spread? Mass migration, regional military escalation, alliance destabilization, economic shockwaves. Because in modern geopolitics, collapse rarely stays contained within borders. Now notice something important. The United States does not categorize danger only through visible warfare. There are three layers of modern threat. Visible threats, missiles, armies, direct attacks. Invisible threats, cyber networks, drug financing, terrorism. Structural threats, unpredictable regimes, institutional collapse, and uncontrollable leadership psychology. And that leads us to the uncomfortable truth. America does not intervene because a country is good or bad. It intervenes when instability becomes strategically uncontrollable. That is the real threshold. Not morality, not speech, not headline. Control, predictability, risk management. And once a regime loses psychological control internally, external pressure almost always follows. But here is the deeper question. Why does American pressure often begin not with invasion, but with individuals? Why sanctions against specific officials? Why financial targeting? Why inner circle isolation? Because modern power understands something ancient. Destroy the confident structure inside the ruling elite, and the regime may collapse without a single missile being launched. The ancient Tibetan Book of the Dead once said, "Collapse is completed not when destruction arrives from outside, but when those within can no longer recognize the collapse already happening inside themselves." Power works the same way. Most regimes are not destroyed first from the outside. They are destroyed internally by fear, paranoia, distorted perception, and the psychological addiction to control. And once you understand that, you stop watching politics as daily news. You begin recognizing the anatomy of collapse itself. In the next episode, we will examine one of the most sophisticated strategies in modern geopolitics. Why America often starts with personal sanctions before direct confrontation. Subscribe, share this video, and join us as we continue decoding the psychology of power before it falls.